Okay, are you ready? Today, the SETA Foundation at Washington, D.C. is launching the new Middle East lecture series with Professor Richard Bulliet of Columbia University. Before getting to Professor Bulliet's presentation, I'd like to give you a brief overview of this program and Professor Bulliet's background. The current wave of change that the Arab Spring in the Middle East is perhaps the most significant change since the end of the Cold War. The current changes in the Middle East caught many off guard, but when looked at from a broader and historical perspective, it perhaps should not have been so surprising. Professor Bulliet will tell you when he foresaw that change coming. While the politicians, policy circles, and pundits respond to these changes through providing their analyses, what's often missing is that the debates on the Middle East in Washington seems restricted by a short-term perspective. As the SETA Foundation, we saw a similar problem with policy discussions on Turkey. That is why we launched the Young Scholars on Turkey program to bring in fresh academic perspective to Turkey discussions in town. And one of our collaborators are sitting right there looking at me. With the new Middle East lecture series, we aim to achieve a similar goal in terms of enriching the policy debates on the Middle East. By inviting academics who are accomplished in their research and analysis on the Middle East, we would like to bring in a broader and long-term perspective to the policy discussions in town. Well, who else to help us achieve that goal than Professor Bulliet? We would like to thank him very much for accepting to be part of this program and kicking it off with us today. And I'd like to thank, as always, our director, Nob Yilmaz, for conceiving of such mischievous ideas as this program. Right there. Professor Richard Bulliet is Professor of Middle Eastern History at Columbia University, where he also directed the Middle East Institute of the School of International and Public Affairs for 12 years. He was born in Illinois, came to Columbia in 1976 after undergrad and graduate work at Harvard, and 8 years as a faculty member at Harvard and Berkeley. He's a specialist on Iran, the social history of the Islamic Middle East, and the 20th century resurgence of Islam. These are only, of course, very few of his interest areas. His interest areas are really broad, and his writings range from animal domestication to various novels, etc. His most recent scholarly work is Cotton, Climate, and Camels in Early Islamic Iran, A Moment in World History, 2009. His earlier books include Hunters, Herders, and Hamburgers, 2005. The Case for Islamo-Christian Civilization, 2004. Islam, The View from the Edge, 94. Conversion to Islam in the Medieval Period, 1979. The famous The Camel and the Wheel, 1975. And also The Patricians of Nishapur, 1972. He has also authored 5 novels, beginning with Kicked to Death by a Camel, and ending with The One Donkey Solution, 2009. And is co-author of a world history textbook, etc. So we have a very accomplished academic and a great mentor, truly great mentor to all the students. So thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stand for at least the first part of this so that I can tell when you're falling asleep, because then I'll know that it's time for me to stop and turn it over to Q&A. I do want to mention that my latest novel, The One Donkey Solution, tells you everything you'll ever want to know about the sexual and religious symbolism of donkeys in association with the Messiah and the end of the world. This is in order to warn you that I don't always behave in a very serious fashion. Now, when it comes to the Arab Spring, as it developed, what struck me was that the last time I was asked to give a lecture in Washington, D.C. was in 1991, 20 years ago, and at the end of that lecture, I said, and it actually was published, and so I can prove I said it, that I expected within the fairly reasonably near future that we would have a year like 1989 in Eastern Europe in which all of the Arab regimes would collapse at the same time. So, in a sense, what's been happening in the Arab Spring did not come as big a surprise to me as perhaps it did to most people. But then the question is, why would I have predicted that? And the reason for that is because I have a historical conceptualization of government in the Arab world that seem to be leading in that direction. And I want to take a few minutes to spell out what that is. In the broad history of 14 centuries of political rule under the aegis of Islam, there is a great dividing point. And that dividing point sort of runs from, say 1150 to 1250, or something like that. In other words, it's a 12th, 13th century dividing point. Before that time, virtually all political claims to rule were based in one way or another on a notion of the imamate, or the caliphate. In other words, there was the idea that there should be, that the rule is legitimized by someone who has a claim of some sort to being the imam, whether designated by God or chosen by the bayah of the people or whatever. But the imamate and the caliphate are the central pieces of this, and the sultanate arises from that, because the notion of a sultan originates as the person who holds the temporal power of the caliph, rather than being a freestanding detainer of power himself. Okay, after say 1260, the caliphate isn't heard of again until Abdulhamid II, basically. And nor is the imamate, except in Iran, where you have a Shiite state created. Instead, you have a long succession of rulers who, because they are not Arab and have no direct claim to spiritual authority, find their intersection with Islam in a different fashion. What happens during this period is that the paramount Islamic title stops being caliph and becomes Khadim al-Haramain, the servitor of the two holy places. That's a title that originates in the aftermath of Salahuddin's conquest of Jerusalem. You had Salahuddin recaptured Jerusalem from the Crusaders in 1187. He sent a letter to the caliph saying, "My valiant troops have retaken the holy city of Jerusalem." The caliph wrote back and said, "Not your troops, the troops of the caliphate." And Saladin wrote back and said, "No, my troops. You didn't lift a finger." And then later that year, the pilgrimage caravan that went from Syria to Mecca, Medina, encountered the Iraqi pilgrimage caravan headed by an Emir al-Hajj appointed by the caliph in Baghdad. And they got into a fight, and a significant fight. I mean, you had a loss of life, people captured, sold into captivity and slavery and so forth. So you had two bodies of pilgrims who are having a mini war in Medina, basically to see who's more important, Syria or Iraq. The Amir al-Hajj from Syria is killed in the fighting, but from that time on, Salah ad-Din makes it clear that he is the master of Mecca, Medina. And the first appearance of the title Khadim al-Haramain, the servitor of the holy places, appears about 3 years later in an inscription identifying Salah ad-Din. It says he is the Sahib Haram al-Sharif, that is to say he's the master of the sacred shrine in Jerusalem, and he's the Khadim al-Haramain. He's the guardian of the two holy places. Perhaps the first time that Jerusalem, Mecca, Medina are all linked under the same rule as the sacred places. That title becomes a standard title for his successors and his family. Then it is picked up by the Mamluks. Then it is picked up by the Ottomans. And the legitimizing role of these rulers in Islamic terms is not a descent from the Prophet or a claim of divine ordination, but simply we're the people who safeguard the pilgrimage. During this time, that is to say from basically in the Mamluk period, from 1250, 1260 onward, Mecca goes from being a ramshackle town of about 5,000 year-round residents to become a great educational center and spiritual center. If you had made the pilgrimage in the year 1000, you would have gone, you would have performed the rituals, you would have gone home, because there was no capacity to stick around in Mecca and Medina. So in the 1200s and 1300s, you start to have madrasas built. There are about 30 madrasas get built in Mecca, sponsored by various potentates and people of wealth, and people go to the pilgrimage, particularly from the southern regions of Islam, Southeast Asia, India, Sub-Saharan Africa. They go to the pilgrimage, and that is where they become learned in Islam. They go, they perform the ritual, and then they stay for 3 or 4 years. When they go home, they're ulama. The importance of the pilgrimage mushrooms in ways that may seem surprising. For example, you have the new phenomenon of pilgrimage certificates, where you have a diploma suitable for framing and hanging on a wall saying that you made the pilgrimage. These become common enough that they are actually printed, so that when you get home, you can go to some appropriate place and buy a printed pilgrimage certificate showing you made the pilgrimage. And perhaps more importantly, the title Haji begins to be used. Before 1200, I have not found any example of anyone commonly being called Haji or Al-Hajj. After 1300, this is a common title that signifies elevated rank in the community. It becomes so clearly associated with prestige that the Christians start to use it for making the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So you have the creation of Greek surnames like Haji Constantinou or Haji Athanasiou, because Haji now means that you have done the most important thing for Islam. In the meantime, there is a caliphate set up in Cairo by the Mamluks, but that caliph is never called Khadim al-Haramain. Instead, the Mamluks create a new institution where they, nobody knows the origins of it, but it's right around 1260. They take a camel, they put an incredibly ornate saddle on the camel that has nothing inside it, but it's decorated with all sorts of things. They parade the camel around to the palaces of all the Mamluk emirs, and then that camel leads the procession to Mecca. When it gets there, eventually you have other rulers who send their decorated camel, but the Sharif in Mecca always accepts the one from Egypt, and later on Syria first, because it symbolizes authority. All right, so what I'm What I'm saying is that part of the legitimacy of these later states comes from their facilitating an Islamic life, rather than from their claiming to be a divinely ordained imam. The second thing that stands out, both first with Salah ad-Din and then with the Mamluks, is their claim that they protect the Muslim world from non-Muslim invaders. The Ayyubids, Mamluks fight Crusaders, the Mamluks fight the Mongols, and their claim is that we as military rulers are justified because we protect you from these outsiders. Now, this is a Mamluk form of government that becomes institutionalized after 1260, in which you have slave soldiers who become part of the Mamluk army. They rise to high command, and then among the top, one of them is selected as a sultan. The governments that in the modern era fit into this model I call neo-Mamluk governments. That is to say, groups of military officers, usually of rather humble social origin, who rise to power, and then one of them becomes the president for a while, until he's no longer useful, or he dies, or is kicked out in a coup, and then another one takes over. In 1 year ago, there were basically 7 neo-Mamluk governments in the Arab world. Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria, Yemen, and Sudan. 2 of those countries were either had recently undergone, or were, in the case of Sudan, still in the midst of civil wars. That really made the notion of civil demonstrations rather different from the others. The other 5 have all proven to be extremely fragile, while none of the monarchies have, because the rest of the Arab states are either monarchies or they are the anomalous cases of Lebanon and Iraq. So the question is, why did these 5, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria, and Yemen, all of which basically had officer governments, why did they collapse? Or why are they in the process of collapsing, or at least under enormous stress, whereas the monarchies are not? Because I think one of the things we have to realize, and all the talking about the causes of the Arab Spring, most of the factors are significant but not determinative. That is to say, you can say, well, there's unemployment. Yeah, well, there was unemployment before. There's unemployment in places that are not collapsing. Say there's Facebook and Twitter. Well, yeah, but there's Facebook and Twitter and other precarious republics like the United States, and we don't have civil unrest. You have any number of factors that do not explain why this particular set of states is the set that is affected. And yet, it is very clear that this is the set of states that have a neo-Mamluk form of officer government of, by, and for military officers. And so there are certain characteristics of that sort of government that I want to highlight. The one that is most obvious, and has been obvious for hundreds of years, incidentally, Western theorists opined in the 19th and 20th centuries that if military officers had Western-style military training, they would become modern scientific people who would usher in an era of modernity in the Muslim world. This was incredibly stupid. But we have it from some of our most eminent theorists who really made no effort to distinguish between military officer formations in the West and military officer formations in the Islamic world. For example, in the West, you have a long, centuries-long, millennium-long tradition of a warrior aristocracy. You have no warrior aristocracy in the Islamic world, at least in the Arab world. It's true that the neo-Mamluks are not of slave origin, but they're usually from village or peasant origin. Someone like Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen really was just a poor peasant before he joined the army. And now he and his family run the country. So that's one of the characteristics, is that the officers with their families, extended families, and their cronies in business see being an officer not as commanding an army in battle, but as a source of enrichment. And these groups are deeply entrenched in the economy in each of these countries. And it's very different from, say, the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned against, because they're not in the arms industry. They're in everything. You know, mango farming, petroleum exploration organizations, urban development, import-export. Almost everything has Army officers or their families or their cronies involved. Basically a kleptocracy of spectacular proportion. If you go back to the 18th century, you find that the businesses in Cairo all had military protectors. It's been described in André Lemon's book on Cairo in the 18th century, where basically the Ottoman military groups and the local Mamluks took, various shops under their protection and ripped off a certain share of the profits as a result. This deep engagement in the economy has been going on for hundreds of years. So that's part of it. But that doesn't make them inherently fragile. In fact, that's been a source of stability. The neo-Mamluk regimes, the officer units, are remarkable among the world's military formations in being risk-averse. With the exception of Saddam Hussein, who was not a military officer and had no training or respect for military officers, no officer-led Arab country has gone to war with another Arab country since World War II. All the wars they fight are against non-Muslim foreigners. Israelis, Americans, British, French. They're defending the Muslim community, but they, as far as with one another, they'll send tanks to the border, they'll exchange nasty notes, they'll rattle sabers, but they don't go to war. And I think part of that is really because they don't want to get killed, they don't want to have all their nice equipment blown up, and they don't want the economy disrupted because they're deeply embedded in the economy. But be that as it may, these are not war-fighting armies for the most part, even though they're commanded by officers. So the credibility of the officer corps has depended a great deal upon whether their local populations believe that they are getting something from these officers that will compensate for the lack of freedom, the lack of participation, the lack of economic dynamism. Because it's been evident for decades that freedom, economic dynamism, and so forth are absent in these neo-Mamluk regimes. So what were they getting? Well, for a long time what they were getting was the opposition to imperialism. Whether it was Israeli imperialism or American or British or French imperialism, these regimes, often more rhetorical than real, talked about how they were standing up for these values, standing up for the Palestinians, standing up for Islam, standing up for this and that. And then they stopped. And that is what I want to stress here. 1991 is the pivotal year. That is the year when the coalition of the willing saw a number of these Arab governments allying with the United States to attack another Arab state in Iraq. And then later in that year, it saw several of these Arab governments sitting down with Israel and ending the state of belligerency. From that time on, what we saw was, in some respects, an enormous success of American foreign policy. American leaders somehow persuaded leaders in the Arab world that the American/Israeli view of the Middle East was the right one. That is to say, the great dangers were militant Islam and expansive Iran, and the Palestine issue was not really so awfully important anymore. And when these Arab Spring demonstrations broke out, the governments that were defending themselves said, "Oh, this is Islamic radicalism." You know, remember Gaddafi saying that Al-Qaeda was putting drugs in the beverages of young people in Libya. You know, he said, well, this is, you know, the claim that this was Islamic radicalism, that the Muslim Brotherhood would take over, or Ennahda would take over, or Al-Qaeda would take over. Who was that appealing to? It wasn't appealing to the people in the street, because in fact these were not religiously active movements, or religiously catalyzed movements. What it was appealing to was the United States. You had a situation very like a Cold War situation in which you would have a dictator in Central America, say, who would face a national liberation movement, and he would say, communist subversion, and we would send in the Marines, or we'd send in massive military aid, say, look, you know, it is so important to struggle against the communists that we will support your dictatorship. And I think that you had a number of regimes that thought that if they said that they were being threatened by Islamic radicalism, the United States and the Europeans would more or less buttress their regimes. Was this imaginary? No, because it's what happened in 1991-92 in Algeria, when the Europeans and the United States said, we would rather have military rule than an Islamic rule. The fact that these demonstrations were not military, were not Islamically catalyzed, gave the lie to these claims. But another point I want to stress in terms of chronology here was sort of 1991, the regimes begin to diminish their long-time stance as being opposed to Western powers and the Israelis, and stress instead Islamic radicalism in Iran. Then in 2000, you had one of the most interesting things that I don't think we pay enough attention to, and that was the appearance on the scene of Al-Qaeda's propaganda, particularly the 2-hour-long videotape that circulated circulated very, very widely. It was made apparently in the year 2000. It shows the bombing of the Cole in the very first scene. That videotape became extremely common, and I personally, I think I've had 36 copies of it in my hands at one time or another. But we never saw it in the United States. We only had tiny clips that were put on the news networks showing somebody shooting at a picture of Bill Clinton in target practice. But the basic argument that Al-Qaeda put forward was never aired. And because that argument was that for decades, Western imperialists and Israelis, Jews and Crusaders, as they call it, have been brutalizing, killing, and mistreating Muslims with impunity. Now is the time to fight back, not to initiate a fight, but to fight back. And the people that you must fight when you fight back are the Crusaders and the Jews, and the officer regimes that give them support. Whether it's the Egyptians or the Iraqis or the Saudis, any regime that was pro-American was targeted. Now, what was interesting about this wasn't whether it was true or not, but the enormous success this met in the public arena in the Muslim world, not even particularly in the Arab world, but throughout the Muslim world. Public opinion polls in 2003 showed extremely high levels of support for the message of Osama bin Laden. But it wasn't that everyone wanted to go off and join the jihad, because they thought that he had things about right. What had happened was that these regimes had abandoned their traditional support of the Muslim community, were no longer defending against Osama's Jews and Crusaders, and were becoming running dogs of the West. I think that was, tremendously delegitimizing for these regimes. And then when you had 9/11 and the aftermath of that, it became even more, because then the United States essentially said, you're either with the terrorists or you're with us. And we demanded that every country accede to the American vision of the war on terror, so that we could invade or bomb or penetrate with intelligence and so forth any country that we wished, and we would expect to have very, very specific intelligence support from every country in the region. This was a wonderful success of American foreign policy and utterly delegitimizing for the regimes that acquiesced in it. And then when, say, Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program, which was pretty pathetic as a program anyway, but still, it made it look like, oh, I really want the West to love me again. Well, these things were delegitimizing. And I think when you look at the long history of Mamluk and then Neo-Mamluk rule, what you see is that even if it's rhetorical nonsense, the regimes must be seen as standing up for what the people believe in foreign policy terms. Opposition, support for Palestinians, opposition to Israel, opposition to imperialism. Because if they don't stand up for that, then what you're left with is a corrupt, ineffective, inefficient, ridiculous government that has no claim to exist. At some point, this form of government was going to collapse, to become delegitimized. And it was a question of when that would happen and what would catalyze it. And that is what we have now witnessed. But then the final thing I want to touch on is what happens next. Because one of the most striking things about the Neo-Mamluk phenomenon, and really the Mamluk phenomenon before it, is its enormous longevity and penetration. The army officers aren't going to go away. They are more important for what comes next than the leaders of new secular parties or religious parties or eminent international civil servants who run for president. When the army is pushed to the side, it doesn't disappear. And particularly the personal economic interests of the officers and the families do not disappear. They find that the officers ultimately are more interested in themselves as a class and in their personal enrichment than they are in ruling. If they can get it all without ruling, that's fine too. But the question is, how long will it take to ease the army out? And here's where Turkey provides the most interesting example. You have the first free elections in Turkey in 1950. The army essentially still feels itself, and is felt by many people, to be potent in terms of determining what the government does, at least down to the 2002 elections. And now it appears that while there are certainly officers who are really opposed to the current government in Turkey, they seem to have lost something, either the will or the legitimacy or the willingness to deal with consequences. They no longer seem to be in a position to intervene. They're becoming more like a military in sort of better ordered states. Now that's half a century. My guess is that for Yemen, for Egypt, for Libya, Tunisia, Syria, assuming Syria falls as well, it's going to take half a century to get the army out. And that anyone who expects there to be just an amazing birth of constitutional freedom and so forth, I think we're going to get new constitutions, I think we're going to get elections, I think we're going to get all sorts of good things. And probably things will look pretty good. But I'd be surprised if in one or another of these states coming down the line we don't see a military coup, because the army will continue to be there. And that is finally the big distinction between what's happening in the Arab Spring and what happened in Iran in the Iranian Revolution. The Iranian Revolution, since the Shah had personally vetted every one of the rank of colonel or general in the Iranian army, at the time of the revolution, all senior officers were either put on retirement or they went into exile. And you saw at the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War, it was almost impossible for Iranians to fight against the Iraqis at anything above battalion level, because they had no officers who had experience with organizing or commanding forces at the level that they needed to, and it took them time to learn. But the result is that the officers left, and the Islamic Republic has not been threatened by officers, although now you have the Revolutionary Guards perhaps creating their own neo-Mamluk phenomenon from scratch. But in these Arab instances, it's interesting that the person who goes will be a Mubarak or a Gaddafi or a Ali Abdullah Saleh or a Bashar al-Assad, but they're just, they're just the top guy, and the officers will remain, and that is the reality we're going to have to deal with. So we have a very exciting Arab Spring where everyone has a lot of optimism about what might come out, and I think in a cosmetic fashion we're going to see some very happy results. But over the next 1, 2, 3, 4 decades, the issue of the entrenchment of military families in the economy and pulling the levers of power and acting in a corrupt fashion and possibly staging coups. This is going to be the great challenge of the Arab world, and is particularly in these neo-Mamluk regimes. Why not the monarchies? Partly, and I'll just finish this because I haven't really thought it out that much, but on a scale of